I know it might cause a lot of thoughts in somebody who's really new to a lot of this information, which is why every day we're always sharing different interviews and different videos, and of course you can make up your own mind. That's the whole point. Is there any means by which any number of individuals can delegate to someone else the moral right to do something which none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? So if you don't have the right to steal from someone, can you give that to someone else and say, well, they can actually do it, even though I can't? You know, this is like the golden rule. And then you just go through each question here. It starts to add up. Do those who wield political power, presidents, legislators, etc., have the moral right to do things which other people do not have the moral right to do? If so, from whom and how do they acquire such a right? In today's world, a lot of people believe that, yes, politicians, police, these people in government have the power to do things which other people do not have the power to do. And what gives them that power is the question, right? It's like this magical piece of paper that grants people rights. But yet, then we say, on the other hand, that people are born with natural rights. So it's very interesting. We live often with these contradictions, and do we really understand them? Number 3, is there any process by which human beings can transform an immoral act into a moral act without changing the act itself? Can theft somehow be justified? Right? You know, could violence, murder be justified in any scenario? That's the question. And they'll say, oh, well, if it's for this, it's for that, it's for that. Well, then if you're making an exception, why are you making that exception? People will say, well, if we violate the individual, we steal from the individual, maybe taxation, we take some people's money and we use it for the greater good, maybe healthcare or for this program, for that benefit, it somehow turns justified. But that's pretty much how every atrocity in history has ever worked out, is, you know, the individual, their rights getting violated for the collective, the greater good. Like, what greater good? What collective? It's not something you voluntarily chose to give your money toward. You're being coerced against your will to give your money towards something you may not support. Right? And we saw abolitionists from the 1800s going to jail because they didn't want to pay taxes that would support different wars. And they also did not use politics to change things, by the way. You'll see all the abolitionists on the side of the screens. On the side of the screen here, you'll see there's Lysander Spooner, who we're not taught about in school on purpose. Frederick Douglass, who presents a strong case against taxation, proving that taxation is connected to slavery in his own autobiography as a slave. Aidan Ballou, who even founded his own town to help the slaves run away. And, you know, these guys were amazing at their time. So just read some of their writings. They understood freedom to a very deep essence, and they were not even 100 years after the American Revolution. Bear in mind, right? These guys, not even 70 years after, they were talking about how the government does not protect the rights of individuals. It actually violates the rights of individuals, the exact opposite of what the Founding Fathers were saying. And they're saying slavery is a good example. And the Constitution was allowing slavery. Lysander Spooner actually fought against that, but yet both those guys are on the same screen here because they both agree that the government doesn't have a legitimate authority. So isn't that interesting? You had a lawyer, Lysander Spooner, arguing not just for the Constitution, but against it as well. Because he said the Constitution doesn't allow slavery, but the Constitution is just a piece of paper and doesn't have the authority to tell people what to do. So, you know, because nobody really consented to it. They were born into the country. They never personally signed it. So he's like, a social contract. I didn't sign anything. Right? And this gives Congress the power to tax people? To take my money against my will? No. Right? Just read his writing called No Treason. Look up No Treason. The Constitution of No Authority. It will blow your mind. It goes into the whole idea of consent. Did you consent to the government you live in? And again, this connects back to the idea of slavery. And here are abolitionists who ended slavery in the 1800s talking about government. Not many historians look at this. This is why we're bringing it back. Government would be nice if it was a self-sustaining entity instead of requiring tax to function. Right. And that's the thing, is like once you get rid of the coercion and you make government voluntary, you have to ask yourself, is it government? Or is it just a bunch of people coming together, organizing with themselves, and not violently imposing their will on another, thinking this is the way how everything should be done? So when you ask about, you know, someone dumping water into a stream or whatever, and people can come up with hundreds of different scenarios, literally thousands, hundreds of thousands. Guess what? There's also hundreds of thousands of solutions, not just one. People think there should be just one solution. And the fact that people think that people coming together automatically means that there's going to be some imagined authority with the right to rule with violence is just wrong. People come together all the time in today's world without the need of violence, and most people don't want violence. They have this belief called statism, which makes them believe that some people have the authority to issue commands to others, the authority, quote unquote, to use violence when other people do not. That's the difference. You can have voluntary hierarchies. There's nothing wrong with hierarchies. The problem is when you turn it involuntary, where people are forced against their will to do something they don't want to do, because that's slavery, right? So you can look up another term, voluntaryism, which is the idea that you want a voluntary world. And it's a very simple moral principle. Most people live by it every day. But they allow involuntary actions and violence, which they may not see in front of their eyes, through government because they believe in it. It's a belief system. Now, in case you don't know what I'm talking about, in connection with these questions, let me show you something else. This one sums up the belief system. And that belief system is called statism, which is the belief in government. So when David is talking about government being slavery, what he's really talking about is the people, which consists of the government, which makes the government, right? We say we the people. They are the ones who allow themselves to be enslaved. So, slavery has always been a mental condition, and the abolitionist said this, the slave said this. When you're mentally enslaved, you're going to be physically enslaved. Statism is the belief that you need somebody to rule over your life or property. So I made this full screen so you can see it. It's the belief that there is such a thing as authority vested in certain human beings, magically giving them the right to rule over other people. So this belief system is not something that naturally happens for human beings. This is something that you're indoctrinated into. It's a way that people keep you on the plantation. You keep believing that you need permission to be free, and you feel like there's no other way you can be free. You can't just say, I'm free. You can't free yourself. You can't defend yourself. You feel like you have to ask for permission, and you need to go through a certain legislative process. You need to become the government itself. You never ask yourself the question of, can I be free? So all this is a matter of education. What I'm doing right now is education. And if it wasn't for the education in the 1800s for ending slavery, there wouldn't have been an end to slavery. The abolitionists were not the politicians. They were staunchly against the politicians, most of them. They didn't want to use politics to end things. They didn't even want a war. But if it weren't for their efforts of education, there wouldn't have been an end to chattel slavery. It was them changing the conscience of everyone at the time who thought that you need slavery for economics, you need slavery for everything in the world. That you needed slavery, otherwise society would not function at all. There would be chaos, they said. Well, that's the same thing people say about the governments to this day. Without government, well, there will be this, there will be that. They make all these assumptions. Are you sure? They say it's a necessary evil. What evil is necessary? So the questions that I put on the screen before, they're also on the right side of the screen now. Someone forcing others. How do you stop these people who are forcing and hurting others? You got to use force to stop them. Or are you saying if we educate them, they'll suddenly stop? No, I'm not saying that. What I meant about education is just what I'm doing right now. Yes, I agree. You should use force to stop someone who's committing violence on another, right? I'm saying no one has the exclusive right to use violence against someone else and be seen as legitimate by others. So government is basically the idea of authority, right? Is the idea that somebody has the right to commit an action which you do not have the right to take. So, in other words, you see that theft and violence is wrong, but yet if it's disguised with the word taxation, it's disguised with the word law, somehow everyone sees it as moral and right, if not necessary and dutiful. So there's a big problem there. The same action is being committed. People believe that violence is right when it's done in the name of authority. That is the belief in statism. You understand? You'd have the right to commit violence in the person committing violence. Right, well, that's self-defense. You're not committing violence. You're simply defending what they're trying to violate. That's what the word violence means. So that's why you say you have the right to self-defense, right? Or the right to bear arms, may you say. Because you're trying to prevent a wrong being done upon your rights. You're trying to prevent a violation, violence, done against you who are just peacefully living your life. Live and let live, golden rule, law of attraction, karmic law, moral law. It's been said 100 different ways. This is the same exact arguments people made in the 1800s to end slavery. Again, if it weren't for these arguments, we would have not ended that practice. It would have continued for another 4,000, 5,000 years. I mean, could you just imagine the fact we ended a practice after thousands of years? That should blow your mind, right? And people nowadays, it seems perfectly fine. Like, yeah, we should not enslave one another. Generally, the average public sees it, yeah, that's wrong, that's ridiculous. They won't even try it because they know it's wrong. But back then, it was normal practice. Everybody did it. It was seen as necessary, natural, and moral because it was seen as necessary. People do crazy things in fear to protect loved ones. You must hate those who want to hurt them. See how love can be turned to hate? Sure. There's nothing wrong with being angry, right? People, especially nowadays, if they look around the world and they say, man, I want my freedoms, they might be angry at the fact that the world is the way it's going and they want their freedom, or they see that there's things that trouble them. I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. What's really bad is mostly fear. And so fear is more so of a bad thing. And this is why a lot of the abolitionists back then were pacifists, if not religious. They used that as another grounds for ending slavery. It's something just to keep in mind, because if you have an understanding of like a natural authority or God's authority over man, you would have a respect for your fellow man, no matter how evil, how bad they are. Not to say that you don't defend yourself, but you would see and say, well, wait, maybe I shouldn't act out of my impulses and out of fear and out of my mere instincts. I should care and think about, what I'm going to do. And sort of not add fuel to the fire per se, right? But again, that's all educative, and that's part of the process. It's understanding, the time and place for defense and the time and place for non-defense. Defending is violent. You can call it violent if you want. That's what I'm saying. There's so many different terms people use. So, for example, people will compare force versus violence, and other people will say violence versus aggression, right? For instance, let me show you an example. This slide shows the difference between force and violence, right? In this perspective, it says force is just the capacity to do work or cause physical change, energy, strength, or active power. Whereas violence is specifically an immoral initiation of physical power. Notice initiation, the first punch, right? The person who threw the first punch, that's it. And they're the ones violating someone's rights, or attempting to violate someone's rights. But you could, of course, can prevent that through the use of force or self-defense. So this is just one example, right, of a perspective of this. But take any animal in nature, most of them are going to defend themselves. Although I don't like to make too many comparisons to us and other animals, because we have morality, we have conscience. This is more of the reason why we can live in order amongst each other, but also the reason why we make all these complex systems. Yeah, using fire versus fire, yeah. Again, I shared with you the perspective of like the pacifism, non-resistance, and then the self-defense side of things. They both have value. And Gandhi would say defending that way is violent force. Sure, Gandhi, I think, especially if you're doing a mass protest, there's a lot of value in civil disobedience. I'd rather be left alone than resort to violence. Right, and that's the thing. People who want to be free, they just want to be left alone. At least that's my point of view too. We just want to be left alone, and we want to do what we want to do with our own money. We don't want to contribute to things we don't want to contribute to. And so that's a voluntary world. It's just that simple. It's a world without slavery, ultimately. Of course, there's still going to be people who do wrong things. There's still going to be evil. The question is, how much will it grow? And evil can only grow when you give it power. How do you give it power if you do not believe in statism? The idea that you can give other people power. To say they're the authority, they get to commit violence, they get to enslave other human beings. That's nonsense. And even if you claim that you want to enslave other human beings, it all depends on if the people of the world understand this belief system. And that's the whole idea of this summit, is to get people understanding what this mentality is. It's the same mentality that keeps the slave on the plantation thinking they're supposed to be enslaved. I mean, Frederick Douglass literally says in his own autobiography, if you read it, he says that he felt happier when his master whipped him less and gave him some benefits, but he realized it kept him more as a slave because he grew comfortable, and therefore it kept him enslaved. He still wasn't free, but because there were benefits that came with his slavery, and slavery was getting less like slavery, he felt better, but it kept him in his servitude, and he realized he still wasn't free. It actually was more dangerous, he said. And that's where we see democracy and republics and all these other forms of government come into play, is where you can see communism or these other forms might, to a lot of people, seem very overtly violent. These other ones are more covert, right? It's like, we the people, you're in charge, you get to vote. But just because, like Lysander Spooner said, again, the lawyer from the 1800s, just because you get to vote for a new slave master or go to a new slave plantation does not make you any more or less a slave. It's either you're free or you're not. And this is why the abolitionists said slavery is bad, end it now. They were called immediatists. You can look this up. It's all in the history books. Right? There were a lot of people at the time who said, well, what if we can end slavery gradually through time? What if we can do it over time, maybe pass some legislation, maybe where the slave masters have to whip their slaves a little bit less here and there? Well, guess what? The abolitionists said, no, slavery is wrong. End it now. If it's wrong, it's wrong. If you allow any wrong, wrong continues to grow. And that's exactly what statism does. When you give someone the power to do wrong, that power is going to inevitably grow. And that's why limited government doesn't work. Because if you limit someone's ability to commit violence on someone, on others, if you limit slavery, you're still saying slavery is okay. Because you're not saying it's wrong. You're saying it's okay if it's like done like this or in this limited amount. So it's bound to grow because people aren't seeing it as wrong, they're seeing it as right. And so, can you limit violence if it's seen by everyone as legitimate? No, you cannot. This has nothing to do with economics. This has everything to do with morality. And morality leads the way toward everything else. The abolitionists weren't concerned with economics at the time. They knew everybody was going to use economics as the means to say that they shouldn't end slavery. But actually cotton production got better after the end of slavery, and things worked out better. There was more freedom, therefore there was more creativity. We see everything improves. Health, creativity, etc. Of course, a lot of the abolitionists, though, because they were criticizing government, said that although they ended chattel slavery, this other form of slavery, known as government, basically took over. They acted like the victors of the war. They acted like they were moral. They acted like they led the charge toward ending chattel slavery. Lysander Spooner said this word per word in his documents. So if you're new to a lot of this should be shocking information, to say the least. And again, this is why we're bringing it to the table in a very professional format as much as we can with this event. I'm not sure why your comment didn't show up on my end, Looney. I didn't see it. It says, well, we want to be loved, very much social beings. I'm looking now on my phone because it's not showing up on the computer. Do we really want to be left alone in the sense of not being coerced? Yeah, we want to be left alone. I mean, people have the choice of what they want to do with their own life, right? That's what makes them free. Socialism is people's own means of production. Communism, removing all hierarchy, money, etc. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's going to be all forms of different economics being used in a free world. That's the beautiful part, though, is no one's being coerced to do something they don't want to do. People can freely associate with what they want to. If they want to build a commune, if they want to share different things, so be it. As long as they're not forcing anybody to do anything against their will. That's not slavery. So those are the ideas we're sharing, guys. Thank you. It's been about 5 hours, so I'm going to end the stream. But I've appreciated the conversation. And hopefully I shared some new things. I left you guys with some resources in case you wanted to learn more. Of course, again, the summit has a lot of the resources I mentioned are also featured in there. So you can download them directly onto your computer and read them, print them, whatever you want to do. One of the great books in the summit, What Anarchy Isn't by Larkin Rose. Sorry, I have like a bunch of other books in my head. What Anarchy Isn't by Larkin Rose. That's a really good book if you're new to a lot of this. Because it really covers a lot of the concerns that people have, like the common ones, right? Like, what about this? What about that? And although I sort of answered it already, it just puts it in a very common sense point of view. I mean, obviously, at 5 hours in, I'm like midnight for me, so I don't even know if I'm speaking correctly to you guys. But nonetheless, I do my best.